So now on to our discussion of colonialism in China. And I think one of the best ways to look at the crossover, the connection of European art, right, to Chinese art is to look at what we call chinoiserie. And this is actually, you'll notice, a French word, not a Chinese word, and it means in the Chinese style. So chinoiserie, right, or in the Chinese style. And chinoiserie is born out of a French movement called Rococo. And if you take art history two, we talk about this movement in depth. Rococo art is born in France, and its main subjects are like sexiness, fun, flirtation, happiness. There's a bit of a scandalous edge that sometimes exists when you look at Rococo art. And it's sort of just, again, a very playful, fun loving movement. It came after the time of Louis XIV and what had been a very, you might say, strict environment. And Rococo sort of allowed the French people to re embrace their playfulness or their happiness again. So, what we're seeing here is the connection between this French art movement and Chinese style, let us say. So, how did this style travel to France? It, of course, traveled to France through trade. So, where sometimes we look at colonialism and we talk about it in a sort of a negative way because it often deals with, diaspora concepts, or in the case of Africa, the very negative subject of slavery. Here, what we're talking about more is this conversation between cultures, might we say, this sort of back and forth, right? That seems to perhaps be happening between the two cultures. And as trade is occurring between Chinese merchants and European merchants, and in this case, French merchants, they're trading more than goods. They're trading also the type of art styles that they both are employing. So, what the famous Rococo artist Boucher does is start to make artworks that use this Chinese style or this chinoiserie influence. The most famous, of course, is the one you're seeing here, which is called the Chinois Galant, or the gallant Chinese, essentially. And what I love about it is it takes Rococo subject matter, the focus on the sensual, the pleasure, and combines it with a Chinese style or look. This one, it's very prominent because it looks like a Ming vase or a Ming vase. And I told you previously that the Ming look is a white base or a white ground with blue decorations. So it's the white ground, as we say, or the white base color, and then you have the blue coloration, right, placed on top of that white. So that's the way that Ming vases look, right, the way that they were created. And so notice here that he takes that Ming look and applies it to what he's doing as an artist. Um, some people also, though, critique colonialist art like this as being stereotypical, that it's not just, let's say, Boucher celebrating the culture, but that it's him creating a stereotype about it. And this is a problematic conversation. I always tell my students it's something that is hard to define, where you stand, I think, a bit, because, you can view this kind of subject matter as romantic. Like, I think of it sometimes as it being like almost a fantasy that Europeans were creating, this fantastical idea of the Chinese world, and how could they then replicate it in their own subjects. For instance, this couple here, they're set in kind of a little Chinese garden. There's a Buddha in the background. There's a little pagoda further off into the distance. So, they're kind of setting into place the markers of you're in a little Chinese garden. And of course, their garments, their hairstyles, right, their dress all reflects the Chinese aesthetic. So it's kind of a fantasy. It's like playing dress up. But at the same time, it also can be looked at as very demeaning. Today, we can look at this as what we commonly refer to as cultural appropriation. And more people, they view cultural appropriation as a negative thing, not any kind of celebration or, something that's good. So again, I think this is a complex conversation that's always evolving, even from the time when I started teaching art history to now. where when I was sort of younger, people talked about sort of the romanticizing of other cultures. And when I was young, I always dreamed about traveling because to me, going to China or going to Japan or going to Africa, it was a dream of a different world that I wanted to experience. And I had nothing but respect for those cultures. I wanted to learn more about them. But I can also see where people could say, well, but you were romanticizing them. You know, you're making them something outside of yourself rather than, maybe seeing them clearly. So again, I think this is a conversation that can come from different angles, and it can range anywhere from like, is this a romantic kind of way of looking at this culture, or is it a way of stereotyping them? Is it a way of having cultural appropriation? And again, I think that's a complex conversation that will continue right into the future. But Boucher, he made a lot of money not just on his typical his typical Rococo works like this, subject, but he also thought a lot about kind of the fantasy element, right, of what's going on here as well. So it's interesting to think about what was driving him, and I think it was trendy, it was stylish, and at this time it was considered romantic, right, to look to a different culture and sort of think about them. This is another Boucher called the Chinese Garden, and again you'll notice the same type of similar themes where it's French people. We can tell that by looking at them, but they're wearing, Chinese inspired garments. They're sitting in a garden with a pagoda and a Ming vase on the ground. And here it definitely could be viewed as much more offensive because the people kind of off to the right appear to be almost like servants who actually do physically look Chinese. So again, hopefully you can kind of think through the problems and the issues of these pieces for yourself and think about the idea of romanticism, cultural appropriation, all these problems. However, I love Rococo painting. I've always still thought these are really beautiful, gorgeous, sumptuous works in the Rococo style. So, I say sometimes you can visually like something, but you don't have to like the subject matter it represents, and that makes it hard. There was a trend also, Boucher, was a very well known fine arts painter, but there was a trend also for people to design their living spaces, their gardens, all in chinoiserie or all in Chinese style. So if you look at the famous Kew Gardens, for instance, you'll note that they have these little architectural edifices kind of sprinkled around, such as the pagoda that you see here, or the famous Woburn Abbey Gardens. And these are all designed gardens, as we say in landscape architectural terms. They're all designed, they're all controlled. There's nothing wild about them. They have to be maintained. And in Woburn Abbey, you'll notice that this maze is set around a Chinese pagoda. So, these fine artists were creating pieces for purchase, but also you'll notice that people were trying to mimic or create the actual physical spaces almost to make like a romanticized landscape to exist within. And again, I think there's this spirit of fantasy that a lot of people carry around with them. I'm definitely of that camp where we enjoy the fantastical, right? And we like seeing it in the spaces around us, the spaces that we're inhabiting. So it was very popular in landscape architecture to have these kind of Chinese inspired gardens. And it was very popular to have interior designers of this time create spaces that used Chinese influence or chinoiserie influence, um, all the way from the kind of the furniture being used, all the way to the decorative objects such as a clock. And these are very elaborate spaces that we're looking at here. And I often, again, wonder what it was like to live in a house like this in France, where you have this sort of Rococo chinoiserie kind of mashup that you're sort of existing within, and living kind of, in a sense, in a fantasy world, or something where, again, you're referencing a culture that you probably have never been to, never seen. And are you seeing it correctly again? Or are you seeing it as a cultural stereotype? Are your motives to celebrate it, or are your motives to, kind of show it as perhaps something that is unreal? So again, I think colonialism throughout our conversation is always going to be a difficult subject to encounter. But next, we'll talk about an even more difficult subject, which is modern China, or the role of Mao and communism.